Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice.
In the first episode of this series, I introduced a simple idea. Every person in a school sees something real, but no one sees the whole school alone. A school is too complex, too human, too layered to be understood from one vantage point. The teacher sees one version of the school, the student sees another. The counselor, the coach, the residence life staff member, the parent, the board member, the advancement officer, the admissions team, the executive leader, each has a line of sight. Each holds part of the truth. The challenge is not that these views are false. The challenge is that they are incomplete. So in this series, I'm exploring what I call the proximity and purpose continuum for schools. On one end is the work closest to students, the daily acts of teaching, advising, mentoring, challenging, supporting, and noticing. On the other end is the work that sustains the institution. Governance, finance, public trust, external relationships, enrollment, facilities, advancement, and long-term planning. Healthy schools, you see, do not choose between these forms of work, but they do learn how to connect them. But if we're going to understand the whole continuum, we have to begin where schools themselves must always begin, with students. More specifically, we have to begin with the work closest to students, the work that gives a school its moral center. It's the work of a teacher who can tell before the first 5 minutes of class are over that something is off, that a student is quieter than usual, or too loud, or suddenly unprepared in a way that does not match their habits. It's the work of the counselor who knows that a student's academic decline is not really about effort, at least not entirely. It's the work of a coach who sees confidence emerging before the student has language for it. It's the work of the advisor who hears the version of the story that does not appear in the gradebook. It's also the work of the adult who notices the student on the edge of the group, the one who is present but not quite included, the one who performs competence so well that others may miss how much they're carrying, the one who is doing fine by every external measure and yet is not really fine at all. Schools often speak in institutional language: mission, excellence, achievement, belonging, opportunity, preparation, transformation. Those words matter, but student proximate work is where those words either become real or exposed as mere decoration. A school can claim to value belonging, but the student experiences belonging in the hallway, in the classroom, the residence hall, the rehearsal room, the lab table, the lunch table, the advising meeting, the moment when someone says, "I noticed you weren't yourself today." A school may claim to value rigor, but student experiences rigor not as slogan, but as a teacher who believes they can do harder work than they thought possible and refuses to let them disappear into mediocrity. A school may claim to value care, but the student experiences care through adults who pay attention, who follow up, hold boundaries, offer grace, and tell the truth. This is why proximity matters. The people closest to students know the things that the institution cannot know from a distance. They know the texture of the day. They know when a policy sounds maybe reasonable on paper but lands awkwardly in practice. They know when students are overwhelmed not because of one assignment or one event, but because the accumulation has become too much. They know which traditions still carry meaning and which ones adults preserve mostly because adults remember them fondly. They know when the culture is healthier than it used to be, and they know when the culture is pretending. That kind of knowledge is not easily captured in a report. It is qualitative, relational, immediate, and sometimes inconvenient. It does not always fit clearly into categories. It may first show up as intuition, irritation, or pattern recognition. A teacher may not have a spreadsheet proving that students are more anxious this semester, but they may know it because they have seen it in office hours, heard it in a class discussion, watched it in missed deadlines, and felt it in the emotional atmosphere of the room. Now, that doesn't mean that instinct is always right. Proximity can misread too. But proximity gives access to forms of understanding that distance cannot generate on its own. This is one of the first obligations of school leadership, to take seriously what can only be known up close. Not to romanticize it, not to treat every concern as automatically decisive, but to honor it as a form of institutional intelligence. Because schools get weaker when they dismiss the knowledge of people closest to students. They get weaker when decisions are made through implementation of a minor detail rather than in the place where strategy becomes reality. They get weaker when leaders assume that because a policy is well-intentioned, it will be experienced as wise. They get weaker when those who work daily with students feel that their insight is solicited ceremonially, but not actually considered. There are a few things more corrosive in a school than the feeling that the people closest to the work are being managed around rather than listened to. But there is another truth here, and I think it matters just as much. Student proximate work, for all its power, also has limits. That's not criticism, but it is simply part of being human. When your work is closest to students, the immediate can become consuming. The student in front of you has a name, the problem has a face, the concern has urgency. The injustice or apparent injustice has emotional force. And because schools are built around young people, that urgency deserves respect. But proximity can also narrow the field of vision. The teacher may see the burden a decision places on students in one course without seeing the broader institutional constraints that produced that decision. The counselor may see the need for flexibility in one student's situation without seeing the precedent that could make fairness harder across the community. The coach or art instructor may see the transformative power of one program without seeing the budgetary trade-offs that require another experience to wait. The adult closest to a student's pain may understandably want the institution to bend toward that student immediately while someone else is responsible for asking what happens when the same principle must be applied across everyone. This is where schools become difficult. Not because one side cares and the other side does not, that's usually the wrong story, but more often the difficulty comes because schools are trying to hold both care and consistency, responsiveness and sustainability, individual need and communal obligation, and all at the same time. The closer we are to students, the easier it can be to experience institutional constraints as indifference. A deadline can feel cold, a policy can feel impersonal, a budget can feel like a failure of imagination. A strategic priority can feel disconnected from daily reality, or a public-facing initiative can feel like performance when the private-facing work is exhausting. And let's be fair, sometimes those critiques are exactly right. Schools can hide behind policy. They can use budget limitations to avoid difficult choices. They can polish their external image while neglecting internal trust. They can mistake institutional language for institutional health. But sometimes the constraint is not indifference. Sometimes, I would argue, it's stewardship. Sometimes the leader is actually saying, not yet, is not failing to care about students, but trying to ensure that the school can still care for students years from now. Sometimes the policy that frustrates us exists because the alternative would make the decisions less fair, less transparent, or more dependent on who has the strongest advocate. Sometimes the external relationship that feels distant from the classroom is part of what protects the classroom for future vulnerability. And that is why proximity needs purpose. The daily work closest to students gives schools heart, credibility, and moral clarity, but if that work becomes disconnected from institutional purpose, it can become reactive. It can become defined by the most immediate need, the most visible frustration, or the most emotionally compelling case. A school cannot live only in that mode. You see, no good teacher teaches only for the mood of the day. No good counselor responds only to the crisis in front of them without also thinking about patterns and long-term growth. No good coach builds a team only around the next play without also developing habits, discipline, and culture. And the same is true institutionally. The work closest to students matters most when it is connected to a larger understanding of what the school is trying to become and what it must sustain in order to serve well. That connection doesn't weaken student proximate work, it deepens it. A teacher who understands the whole school can advocate more effectively because they can connect classroom realities to institutional priorities. A counselor who understands the larger strategic picture can help leaders see not only individual student concerns but emerging patterns that should shape future decisions. A coach or residential life staff member who understands public trust and institutional reputation can help students see that their choices are not merely personal, but also communal. A student support professional who understands governance and policy can push for compassion in ways that also preserve fairness. So in other words, seeing beyond proximity does not mean caring less about students. It means learning how to care for students in ways that can endure. And I would argue that distinction is very important because student proximate adults are often asked to carry enormous emotional weight. They absorb student anxiety, they mediate conflict, they respond to disappointment, they celebrate the kind of growth that others never see. They enforce expectations and then help students recover from that enforcement. They are expected to be rigorous but humane, available but boundaried, consistent but flexible, encouraging but honest. And much of that work, sadly at times, is invisible. A school community may celebrate test scores, college admissions, championship seasons, performance awards, scholarships, and graduation. It may not always see the hundreds of small interventions that made those outcomes possible. The hallway conversation in passing, the second draft, the quiet redirection, the parent phone call, the late-night residence hall check-in, the advising meeting where a student finally says what has actually been going on, the teacher who stage patient through the stage when a student is capable of more but not yet mature enough to show it reliably. Schools are built on this kind of work. Not only in the dramatic moments, but the ordinary faithfulness of adults who keep showing up with attention. That is why any serious conversation about school improvement, strategy, innovation, or leadership has to remain grounded in student proximate reality. Otherwise, the institution begins to float above itself. It can become fluent in aspiration, but thin in practice. But grounding is not the same as stopping there. The purpose of proximity is not to make the nearest concern the only concern. The purpose of proximity is to keep the institution honest. It reminds us that that students are not abstractions. They are not enrollment units, achievement data, demographic groups, or future alumni. They are very much young people living through school in real time. They are forming identities, testing limits, making mistakes, building confidence, and deciding whether the adults around them can be trusted. And to be clear, that trust is more fragile than we give it credit. It is built through consistency between what the school claims and what the students experience. And the people closest to students are often the first to know when that consistency is strong and when it is breaking. They know when students feel seen. They know when students feel managed. They know when expectations inspire and when they merely exhaust. And they know when adults are aligned and when students are learning to navigate the gaps between adult messages. They know when a school's culture is healthy enough to tell the truth about itself. That is why leaders should listen carefully to student-proximate adults. But listening carefully does not always mean agreeing immediately. It doesn't mean every close-up perspective becomes policy. It means treating proximity as a very necessary form of evidence, and it means asking what the people closest to students can see that others cannot. It means bringing their insight into conversation with other responsibilities like finances, governance, mission, sustainability, equity, and the needs of students who are not in the room. The best schools don't ask student proximate adults to abandon their advocacy. They ask them to strengthen it by connecting it to the whole. And that requires trust in both directions. Leaders have to trust that the adults closest to students are not merely complaining when they raise concerns. Often, they are very much reporting from the front edge of the mission. And those closest to students have to trust that institutional leaders are not always detached when they ask broader questions. Often, they are very much trying to protect the conditions that allow the mission to continue. And so when that trust exists, the school becomes wiser. The teacher does not have to carry the whole institution alone. The administrator doesn't have to interpret student experience from a distance. The counselor doesn't have to translate patterns only in moments of crisis. The board doesn't have to rely solely on dashboards and formal reports. And the student does not have to wonder whether adults are paying attention to the difference between what is promised and what is lived. The school develops a fuller field of vision. That's the larger argument of this series. Seeing the whole school requires honoring the view from up close without assuming it is the only view that matters. Because there are some things that can only be seen up close. You can only know the sound of a classroom by being in it. You can only feel the difference between compliance and engagement by watching students wrestle with difficult work. You can only understand certain forms of belonging by seeing who relaxes when they enter a room and who remains guarded. You can only know some kinds of student growth by being present long enough to remember who that student used to be. These are sacred forms of knowledge in a school, but they are also the things that cannot be seen only from up close. You may have a donor relationship that made a program possible. You may see the legislative concern that protected a funding stream. You may not see the enrollment trend that will shape staffing 3 years from now. You may not see facilities decisions that determines what future students will be able to do. You may not see the governance concern, the legal risk, the public narrative, or the strategic opening that requires attention before it becomes urgent to everyone else. That is where the next episode will turn. If this episode has focused on the work closest to students, now the next one will focus on the work that often happens beyond the daily line of sight. The stakeholder proximate work of families, boards, alumni, donors, civic partners, policymakers, and the broader public. That work can be easy to misunderstand, especially for those whose days are spent in the immediate presence of students. It can look distant, it can sound abstract, and it certainly can feel removed from the heart of the school. But at its best, that work is not a departure from mission. It's one of the very ways mission is sustained. And if we want to see the whole school, we have to understand not only what can be seen up close, but what also must be tended from a distance.
A Slice with Dice is a production of AlderCube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.